I'd like to begin the shir tonight for Parshas VaYeishev, where we pick up where we left off last year. And if you can open up to Perek Lamed Zayin, Pasuk Yud Aleph. Vayikanu bo echav. After Yosef reveals his dreams, the Torah records that his brothers envied him. V'aviv shamaris hadover. But the Torah emphasizes that his father Yaakov awaited the matter. There seems to be a little bit of a stira here, a contradiction. On the one hand, Yaakov gives tochacha to Yosef, etc., etc. But on the other hand, Shamar es hadover, he awaited the matter. If Yaakov disapproved of the dream and it had no significance, why is he awaiting the matter? Why is he shomer es hadover? If Yaakov anticipated the dream and its fulfillment, then why reprimand Yosef for the dreams? Apparently, we have to derive the conclusion that although Yaakov understood that the dream would come to fulfillment, and therefore shomer es hadover, but nevertheless, there was a flip side to the dream, and Yaakov understood that Yosef was totally unaware of the flip side, of the opposite. Yes, on the one hand, it seems that the spiritual dependence of the brothers on Yosef and the physical dependence of the brothers on Yosef would come to fruition. But Yaakov understood that there was something here antithetical to the dream that would come to pass, and Yosef was not aware of it. There's going to be a time down the line when the roles are reversed, when Yosef is going to be totally dependent upon his brothers for his entire spiritual destiny. On the one hand, again, Yaakov understood that the brothers would rely and depend upon Yosef, and that for their physical being, they would not be able to support themselves and survive without the help of Yosef. And in that sense, the role of Yosef clearly is that of the leader. He's carrying the brothers on his shoulders. They are totally dependent upon him. But on the other hand, the role, respectively, the roles of both Yosef and his brothers are going to reverse. They're going to come out to be the second and the exact opposite. And Yaakov foresaw, Baruch HaKodesh, that the day will come when Yosef will be totally dependent upon his brothers for his spiritual future. And that, in a sense, it's not all one-sided. It's not all that the brothers depend upon Yosef. There's going to be a reciprocal balance over here. There's going to be, in a parallel sense, Yosef depending upon his brothers. And that would create a balance. When and where do we find in the Chumash that Yosef is dependent upon his brothers? And here we open up to Perek Lamed. To Perek Nun. At the end of Parshas VaYeishev, and the Torah says in Pasuk of Daled that Yosef turns to his brothers And he says, Anochi mes, I'm going to die. Velokim pakod yifkod eschem, ve'elo eschem in ha'aretz hazos, el ha'aretz asher nishbal Avraham litzchak Yaakov. Vayashba Yosef es b'nei Yisrael lemar pakod yifkod elokim eschem, ve'halisem es hatzmotzai mizeh. And Yosef is begging his brothers to bury him in Eretz Yisrael, not in Eretz Mitzrayim. When you think about it, it's really quite amazing. Here is Yosef, the leader, the viceroy of Mitzrayim. He has the power to judge his brothers. He has the power to put them to death. And yet, they beg for their lives, but now the tables are turned. Yosef is begging for his spiritual life. This ultimately powerful, all-powerful leader is now powerless to accomplish what he needs so desperately, to assume his place and be buried together with the tribes of Israel, the Shiftei Kah, to have his stone etched in the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol, in the Choshen. All this depends upon the brothers. Yosef can't guarantee that. He needs the help of his brothers. He begs them, do not bury me here in Mitzrayim. So therefore, we can appreciate that on the one hand, Yaakov, Shomar es Hadavar, he understood very well that the role of Yosef is that of the leader, and his brothers are dependent upon him, on Yosef. But on the other hand, the flip side, and here's where Yaakov is critical of Yosef. Yosef, you make a big mistake. You're under the mistaken impression that the brothers are dependent on you, and it's a one-way street. That your brothers depend upon you physically and spiritually. You are the leader. But Yaakov knew that down the line, there'd be more of a symmetry here, and that the brothers would ultimately determine the future of Yosef. Let us look now at Pasuk Yud Daled here in Perek Lamed Zayin. Yaakov sends Yosef on a very dangerous mission. Vayomalo lech na re'eh eshlom achecha. Go down and see the peace of your brothers. I'll read to you the English. Go now and see your brother's welfare. Vashiveni dover, bring back the word. Vayishlacheu me'emek Chevron, and he sent him from the valley of Chevron. Rashi, famous, Rashi says, Valo Chevron Bahar Hoya, it was on a mountain. So what does it mean? Me'emek Chevron, ela me'etza amuka shaloso tzadik hakover b'Chevron, l'kayim ashenemar li'Avraham bein habesorim ki ger yezarach. The Torah speaks here of Emek Chevron, the valley of Chevron. Rashi says this is an allusion to the bris bein habesorim, because Avraham Avinu, the recipient of that bris, is buried in Chevron. And ger yezaracha b'eretz lo lahem. Avram received the nevuah, the prophecy, at the bris bein habesorim in Emek Chevron, not in Emek Chevron, but I mean to say Avram from Emek Chevron, that the Jewish people will be enslaved, they'll be oppressed. And now Yaakov understands that as a result of the hatred and the enmity of the brothers to Yosef, sending Yosef on this mission is absolutely antithetical. It's counter any logic whatsoever. What a dangerous mission to expose Yosef at this point to his brothers, knowing full well that they're so envious of him. They have hatred to him. What a dangerous mission. And the answer to this is Emek Chevron. There's a divine providence that's bringing about an entire chain of events that was foretold back at the Brisbane of Asarim when HaKadosh Baruch Hu transmitted the Nevuah to Avram Avinu. And now Yosef is being sent on a mission that is the kickoff. It is the beginning of the fruition of that prophecy that was given to Avram Avinu, Emek Chevron, or Avram Avinu, at the Brisbane of Asarim, Ki Ger Yezarach B'Eretz Lo Lahem. This now is the beginning of that slavery, when Yosef is going to be taken by his brothers and sold as a slave down to Mitzrayim. And Chazal tell us that on this very day that Yaakov sent Yosef on this mission, Lech Nore'eh, etc., HaKadosh Baruch Hu was busy in creating the R of Melech HaMashiach, the light of King Messiah. What's about to happen here in Parshas VaYeishev, what's about to unfold, is an entire chain of events that's going to lead the Jewish people into Mitzrayim. And it was all initiated on this day when Yaakov sends Yosef on this mission. And the chain of events is going to happen one after the other as a result of divine providence. To some extent, I would suggest that in the fulfillment of the divine prophecy regarding the Egyptian exile to Avram Avinu, which is the destiny of the nation, the players, individual players on the table of this game, are not necessarily making their own decisions. There's a higher force, which is Hashgacha Pratis, that is moving them on the table, so to speak, from place to place, with or without their logical decision-making. Yaakov is certainly not making a prudent decision. Pragmatically, it doesn't make sense. It's illogical to send Yosef down to his brothers, knowing full well the danger involved. But there's a higher will that is being realized, and there's an entire chain of events that's unfolding right here from the beginning of Yosef's mission to go down to see his brothers. It's very interesting that Chazal tell us that after Yaakov sent Yosef, he actually accompanied Yosef down the mountain. When they got down to the valley, which is called Emek Chevron, that's when Yaakov gave Yosef the instructions to go down to his brothers in Shechem and ask the question, according to Chazal, that Yaakov accompanied Yosef down the mountain. Why did he do so? But the answer is this is all being orchestrated by Hashgacha Pratis. And everything that happens in this story, blow by blow, pasuk by pasuk, is an unfolding of divine providence. There's symbolism in every single dimension of this parsha. Yaakov was well aware of the hatred of the brothers to Yosef. He understood very well that to send his son Yosef and expose him in Shechem to find about the welfare was a foolish decision. But yet, somehow, magically, Yaakov did not calculate the repercussions and the consequences, the dangerous errand that he had sent his son Yosef on. Did Yaakov realize that by sending his son Yosef to Shechem, he would not see his son for 22 years? He wasn't kissing him goodbye for a month or a week till he fulfilled this errand, this mission. 22 years would pass. And Yaakov was unaware of the fact that this was all orchestrated by divine providence. When a person stands on a mountain, he has a very wide, vast perspective. But when he climbs down into a valley, he can hardly see anything. His vision is very limited. The Torah wants to emphasize that Yaakov was down in the mountain. He climbed and accompanied Yosef from a higher place to a lower place. And now his vision, Yaakov's vision, was very cramped, was very limited. The Ruach HaKodesh that Yaakov normally had was now separated from Yaakov. And therefore, Yaakov lost his perspective when he climbed down from the top of the mountain. Yaakov was now in a valley, Emek Hebron, and his perspective was very limited. And he had made a decision sending his son Yosef on a very dangerous mission, which was illogical and made no sense. But the symbolism of Emek Hebron is not only that this is the beginning of the process of Golus Mitzrayim, the fulfillment of the Bris Bein Besarim, Geri Azaracha, but also in addition, this is a symbol of the limited vision that Yaakov was able to have, missing the point here, making an illogical decision because he's stuck in Emek Hebron, where his field of vision is very limited. And to continue with this story as it unfolds and its symbolism, let's take a look at Pasuk Tezvav, Vayimte'eu Ish. And Yosef is found by an Ish. Who is this Ish? And this Ish plays a dramatic role in the entire episode of Mechiras Yosef. The first question we should ask is, why did he approach Yosef? I mean, after all, this Ish presumably did not recognize Yosef. Why approach a person when you don't recognize, you don't know who he is? And yet the Torah repeats over and over again this Ish, pasuk after pasuk. Somehow, even though the Torah could have left out the word Ish, it repeats it over and over again to emphasize that there's some unusual character here who's playing a coincidental, in inverted commas, role, a strange role in the unfolding of these events. He's an anonymous person, faceless, has no name. Torah doesn't describe him. He doesn't know Yosef. He probably never met Yaakov either. And he approaches Yosef, tactless. Somehow he guessed that Yosef was lost. And Vayimte'eu Ish, a man found him, V'hinei, and behold, Toa Badar Masada, he was straying in the field. And the amazing thing is that when the Ish, again a second time, asks Yosef what's going on, Yosef actually pours his heart out to this anonymous person that he's never met in his life. Vayomer Sachai Anochi Mevakesh. In a sense, he confides in this anonymous man, this stranger. I am looking for my brothers. And coincidentally, as the story turns out to be, this anonymous Ish can identify with Yosef's question and tell him that I met these 10 people before. What a coincidence. And he tells Yosef, who says to him, Hagidon Oli Eifo Em Roim. Yosef already senses that this man is not just a coincidence. He knows exactly where the brothers are. And it's all part of this divine providence, part of this plan. Vayomar ish nasu mizeh, shamati om nelech dosaina, and he sends Yosef to Dosan. The brothers are no longer in Shechem. The Ish, this anonymous, unidentified person, tells Yosef that if you're looking for your brothers, you should know they left Shechem and they're on the way to Dosan. And that's what I heard. Go to Dosan. Apparently, the Torah repeats this name Ish, this word Ish, over and over again to tell us that this Ish is nothing less than an angel who is watching over the entire history of the Jewish nation. He is being sent on a mission by the Almighty to guide the events, to achieve the goals that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to achieve. He meets Yosef, and the upshot, the result of this meeting, is the entire drama that's about to unfold. A complex, puzzling drama, an awesome drama. Yosef initially is hesitant. He's lost. He is no doubt afraid to fulfill the mission that his father had burdened him with, to go to his brothers. He knew very well the danger involved, but he somehow surrenders. He surrenders to the Ish representing the angel of Jewish destiny. The Ish made a decision on behalf of Yosef, and Yosef could not make the decision alone. It was not Yosef's decision to go to Dosan. That would have been a dangerous mission. Instead, the Ish seals the fate of Beis Yaakov, of the entire household of Yaakov. And as a result, the entire household of Yaakov is exposed to bondage, to slavery, to oppression, to affliction, to loneliness. All this is initiated by the Ish, who represents the angel of heaven, who is there to watch over Jewish history and guide the events. So Yosef acts and implements the instructions of this Ish, this mysterious, faceless, anonymous man. And basically, everyone, all the human beings that are involved in this story of Mechiras Yosef, they were all acting not logically and pragmatically, wisely, but somewhat compulsively, compelled, as it were, by the force of Jewish history. Did they actually consider their actions? Did they weigh them and ask themselves, are these actions good? Are they sound? Are they the right decisions? There's the impact of Jewish destiny upon their shoulders. And they are, so to speak, forced because of the realization of history of the Jewish people to act as pawns in the hands of God and his angels to fulfill the will and the plan of God. We'll see this in Yirtzeh Hashem again next week when we talk about Yehuda and his whole episode with Tamar. There's a very important pasuk here that has to be understood again in the light of the premise that everything here in this parsha is symbolic. Pasuk Yud Ches. VaYiru'o so mirachok. They saw him from a distance. Of course, ein mikra yotze de pshuta, but on a symbolic level, there's a profound metaphor here in that they saw Yosef from afar. They never actually came close to him, never. On the one hand, they rejected him. They never appreciated his strange behavior. And on the other hand, Yosef himself was an enigma. His whole personality was concealed. The inner personality in its inner chambers. And the brothers could never really pry into that inner chamber and reveal it. What did the brothers see when they looked at Yosef? How did they interpret his personality? How did they understand who is Yosef? On the one hand, he's their younger brother, and they should feel compassion. But on the other hand, the inner beauty of this young man was totally hidden to them. They did not appreciate his kedusha because it was hidden and concealed behind his external appearance. Yosef was a very handsome man. He wore a garment, a coat of many colors. And this was an external covering for what was taking place in the chambers of Yosef's personality underneath the surface. It was all concealed. The brothers looked at Yosef and his beauty, and they interpret it as purely superficial. Let's take a look at a pasuk in Parshas VaYeishev. And this is Perek Nun. Actually, right before Perek Nun, Perek Memtes. Pasuk Yud Beis. Yaakov says about Yosef, Chachlili einayim miyayin uleven shinayim echala. He has like red eyes like wine, white tooth like milk. Who is Yosef? Yosef is someone who's beautifying himself. He's combing his hair. He's hanging out with the lowest of the shvatim, playing with them. As Rashi says, Maisa Narus. Everything about him, from the perspective of the brothers, is superficial. His beauty is superficial. And women strode to see him. And he is beautifying himself. You might use the term, he's a ladies' man. And that's how the brothers viewed him. All of the inner sanctity of Yosef was concealed. Vayiru oso merachok. There was only one person on the face of the earth that truly understood who Yosef really was, and that was Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov understood that the flocks of hair and the beautiful, handsome man with dream-filled eyes was really a concealment of a deeper personality, a personality of great strength, of amazing kedusha, of purity, of soft refinement, An individual who is given to a vision of transcendental worlds. A young man who is swept by emotions, by yearnings for the geula, for the ultimate redemption, for reaching God, for transcendental experience. Only Yaakov understood that. Only Yaakov appreciated the dreams of Yosef. The brothers thought that Yosef was not a pure heart and a modest soul. All he was concerned about was his appearance. So the brothers looked at their younger sibling, their handsome young man, with suspicion. He was guilty of paying too much attention to himself. As Rashi points out later on in the Parsha. And he's guilty of expressing a pride about himself. He's building up himself. The sun, the moon, the 11 stars were prostrating themselves to me, says Yosef. And in truth, even after his death, Yosef remains a hidden personality. Vayiru oso mirachok. They saw him from afar. They saw him as a cold, sort of white statue, completely devoid of any warmth, of any spiritual purity. Even in Perek Nun, describing the embalming of Yosef, they turned him into a freezing cold mummy. No one except for Yaakov really recognized Yosef for who he truly was. And so, in Pasuk Yutes, Vayomru ish alachav, hine bal hachalomos hazeh ba. The dreamer is coming. Another expression of the envy and the hatred that the brothers held in their hearts for Yosef, which was an enmity and a jealousy that increased manyfold in the aftermath of Yosef revealing his dreams to them. And why did the brothers call him Baal HaChalomos? Why didn't they call him Baal Ktones Pasim, the many-colored, multicolored coat? A Baal HaChalomos is not a dumb person. He's a bright individual. He's gifted. He's a leader, an initiator, a visionary. And that's what Yosef was. Yosef had a spark of prophecy, a charismatic personality. And the brothers were jealous. They wanted to stop him. They wanted to squelch his dreams. But prophecy is overwhelming. It's a force that cannot be suppressed. As the Rambam writes in Mor Nevuchim, based on a pasuk at the beginning of Malachi, where the Navi describes prophecy as a masa, a burden, says the Rambam, prophecy is truly a burden. In experiencing his vision, the prophet encounters a sublime truth that others have not. He is compelled to share his message, to impart the information so that others will know what he knows. God's revelation is a burden weighing upon his consciousness. Often sharing his burden puts him in grave danger. People try to avoid hearing his message. Yet, the burden of prophecy gives the prophet no rest. He must repeat what he hears from God, whatever the consequences are. And therefore, Yosef, when he receives the prophecy of the dreams, he is forced and compelled to share them with his brothers. So if you ask me what lies at the heart, at the base of the sin of Yosef's brothers, to sell Yosef, their attempt to block his visionary power, it is the fact that they misunderstood Yosef and they saw him from afar. And where is the great leadership of Yehuda? Pasuk Chavav, Vayomer Yehuda lechav, ma betza ki narog esachinu. What is the gain if we slay his brothers? The Gemara in Sanhedrin on Daf Vav Beis says that whoever praises Yehuda for saying, what is the gain if we slay our brothers? He's a Megadef, he's an abuser. Yosef and Yehuda represent two, in a sense, antithetical personalities. The personality of Yosef is a natural, ethical, inborn nature, but Yehuda has natural tendencies that are negative, that can be even destructive. Yehuda was in a position to save Yosef and return him to father Jacob, but instead, he tells the brothers, we should sell him as an eved, as a slave. On one level, Yehuda's consciousness would not allow him to commit murder. That was appalling. But what was the compromise that he proposed? To sell Yosef to the Ishmaelim? That's a very strange compromise, very cruel. Chazal criticized Yehuda severely in the sharpest terms because Yehuda messed up and missed on a golden opportunity. And then we get to Reuven. Where is Reuven? The Bachar, the eldest. Take a look at Chaf Tes. VaYeishev Reuven al Abar, v'hinei ein Yosef Abar. Reuven returns to the pit, and Yosef is gone. It was Reuven who had declared that we should not spill the blood of our brother. True, his intention was good. He had the intention of saving Yosef. But at the moment of the actual sale of Yosef, Reuven was nowhere to be found. Where was Reuven at the sale? The Medrash says in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, he was busy, and Rashi quotes it, fasting and sackcloth. And when he was free of that fasting, he took a look into the pit, and where was Yosef? No one is acting sensibly here. No one seems to be in full control of a decision. And this is all part of the plan, the divine plan of the Ish. The Medrash tells us that it came to pass when Israel sojourned in the land, Reuven went and lay with Bilhah, his father's Pilegesh. Yisrael heard of it, and so the sons of Yaakov were 12. And this we saw back in Perek Hey. The Gemara in Shabbos on Daf Nun Hamid Beis. Whoever maintains that Reuven sinned is making an error, meaning to say that he slept with Bilhah is an error. For it says in the end of the pasuk, now the sons of Jacob were 12, meaning that they were all equal. Says Rashi, when Rachel died, Jacob took his bed, which was placed regularly in the tent of Rachel, and now he moved it and placed it into the tent of Bilhah. Reuven resented the fact that there was an insult to his mother, and he said if Mother Leah was subordinate to Rachel, must she also be subordinate to Rachel's maidservant, handmaid? And therefore he rearranged Yaakov's bed, moving it into the tent of Leah. Why is it now at this particular junction, when Yosef was thrown into the pit, that Reuven chooses to do tshuva, fasting, and wearing sackcloth. And it seems to me that Reuven at that moment, at the episode of Mechiras Yosef, began to realize, it dawned upon him, the staggering implications and repercussions of his sin. It was Reuven who was the first to undermine the respect for Yaakov by acting disrespectfully towards Yaakov. In the incident of Bilah, the brothers witnessed this activity of Reuven, and their respect for Yaakov went down. If you look at the deed itself, Reuven's infraction was minor. He just moved his father's bed into his mother's tent. But the consequences of that event were devastating, because Reuven basically undermined the authority and the respect, the awe of the brothers for Father Jacob. And in the ensuing story, the episode, after the respect for Yaakov was diminished, the brothers were willing to propose killing Yosef. And at that point, it dawned upon Reuven the implications of his actions. And he immediately, hearing the threat to the life of his brother Yosef, realized, it's time for me to do tshuva. And he was taken up with fasting and sackcloth. Before we go on, I would like to turn, if you will, to the Haftorah of Parshas VaYeishev, taken from Amos. Ko Amar Hashem al shlosha pish'ei Yisrael v'al arba'a lo ashiven. Thus says God, for 3 transgressions of Israel, yes, for 4 I will not revoke the punishment. What is the connection between the Haftorah and Parshas VaYeishev? That 4th transgression is an allusion to the crime of Mechiras Yosef. And according to Targum Yerushalmi, when the brothers sold Yosef as an Eved, what did they receive in compensation? Enough money to purchase a pair of sandals. However, I would like to suggest that there's a connection between Parshas VaYeishev and the beginning of this pasuk, the first part of this pasuk. When the brothers sold Yosef, they assumed that no one would discover their crime. Yosef would probably die in captivity, or alternatively would be assimilated into a foreign culture. And 23 years later, when this episode seems to have been forgotten, the brothers were totally shocked. They couldn't imagine that the day would come and they would be called to account for their sin, for their crime. Yosef reveals himself. They're stunned and frightened. What exactly happened? Are they afraid of punishment? I think not. I think it was a sudden discovery that they were operating with a mistaken assumption the whole time, that ultimately their crime would catch up with them, and ultimately retribution will be exacted against them, as it was during the entire give and take of this episode with Yosef. We know that one of the great problems that religious people face is Tzadik Viralo Rasha V'Tov. The pasuk says, "Al Shlosha Pishei Yisrael," a crime that's perpetrated twice and then three times does not necessarily bring immediate retribution. And many people assume that if there's no retribution, then the punishment will never arrive and the Rishonim will have it easy. How do you reconcile that with the concept of Schar V'Onesh, of Kel Emunah, the God of justice? And the Gemara in Brachos Daf Zayin claims that Moshe Rabbeinu presented this dilemma to the Ribono Shel Olam and many prophets afterwards. The concept of Rasha V'Tovlo is the central concept of the book of Iyov, Tzadik Viralo. The delay of reward and punishment, which causes such bilbul and perplexes believers in God. In the case of Elisha ben Avuya, it contributed to the apostasy. But the idea of Judaism is lo ashivenu, meaning, will I not bring about justice, reward and punishment, reward for the tzaddikim, punishment for the rishonim? It will be delayed. And as a result of that delay, the brothers think they're okay. Decades go by, no one remembers the criminal act. They weren't punished. And this is the message of the Haftorah. There will be a day of justice. Justice for the good, for the tzaddikim, and justice for the opposite, for Rishonim. And then the Haftorah continues. Al hanavim tzivisem lemar lo sinvo. If we translate this literally, pasuk Yud Beis, and commanded the prophet, saying, "Do not prophesy." What is the meaning of this pasuk in the context of Mechiras Yosef? When we think about the brothers, their envy, their hatred to Yosef, which only increased when Yosef revealed his dreams, as we spoke about earlier, and they referred to Yosef as the Baal HaChalomos Hazeh, forget about the Ksonos Pasim. It would seem that if Yosef had not revealed his dreams, this entire tragic episode of Mechiras Yosef would never have taken place at all. But as we said before, the brothers see Yosef as the Baal HaChalomos. Yeah, he's bright, he's gifted, he's a visionary, and all that we discussed. He has a prophetic spark, a charismatic personality. But the brothers want to squelch those dreams. And they transgressed. And what was that transgression? To block Yosef's visionary power. But Yosef, for his part, carries, as we said earlier, the burden of prophecy on his shoulders. It's an overwhelming force that cannot be sublimated. And Yosef has to reveal the dreams to his brothers. This Haftorah from Amos, if we know about the contemporaries of Amos, they too wanted to stifle the prophecy of Amos. But Amos tells them that the prophet cannot be suppressed. These adversaries, the contemporaries of the prophet Amos, do not prophesy. And we find the same thing in Yirmiyahu Hanavi, in Perek Chaf. And Yirmiyahu declares, yet, if I were to say I will not mention him or speak in his name anymore, his word, meaning the divine word, would be like burning fire in my heart, stored in my bones. And though I might struggle to contain it, I cannot contain it. Such is the story of Yosef and his dreams. And at the end of this Haftorah, in the very last pasuk, Aryeh Sha'ad, the lion has roared. Milo Yira, who will not fear? Hashem Elokim Diber Milo Yinove, God, our Lord, has spoken. Who can but prophesy? This Haftorah, like all Haftorahs, was meant to strengthen our emunah in the Geula, in the return of Knesset Yisrael to the land of Israel, and in Bias HaMashiach. And that's why every Haftorah, no matter how difficult and full of words of rebuke of the Navi, nevertheless, it will always conclude with Divrei Nechama, with Tikva, with hope, and with Tefillah, with prayer. And the last words in each Haftorah, no matter how dismal the Haftorah is, will express the idea of comfort. The fact that Bnei Yisrael, the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, looks forward to a bright future. The nation will return to the land of Israel, the promised land, its homeland. These are the words of encouragement of every single Haftorah that calls upon us never to despair. The promise for a bright future will come to fruition. And even on Shabbos Chazon, right before Tisha B'Av, we conclude the maftir with a note of encouragement, consolation, and hope for redemption. However, every rule has its exception. And the exception to this rule is the Haftorah that we'll read in Mitzvah Shem Shabbos. The Haftorah that deals with the sale of Yosef. And the idea expressed in this Haftorah is corruption, a community of corruption that is fit for censure and punishment. Had this battle between Yosef and his brothers not taken place, the entire course of history would have changed. And Yaakov and his mishpacha, his household, would have immediately come to live in the land of Israel, enter the land permanently, and the ultimate geula would have taken place. But because of Mechiras Yosef, Hashkacha chose an entirely different path for our nation. And the path to redemption, the road to geula, is very long, very tiresome, very challenging. And therefore, that moment of Mechiras Yosef is the most tragic moment in Jewish history. And therefore, this Haftorah does not end with Divrei Nachal. Perhaps a major dimension in the sin of the brothers is written here in Perek Lamed Ches, in Pasuk Lamed Aleph. Vayishchetu seir izim vayitpelu es kakones badam. They slaughtered a kid and they dipped the coat in the blood. Vaishalchu is ksonas hapasim, etc., etc. Perhaps when parents raise their children, and they may have preferences, but it's not in good interest to reveal those preferences. Therefore, parents should be well advised to hide their preferences. But Yaakov Avinu apparently did not go down that path. He didn't make any effort in hiding his preference for Yosef. And he gives Yosef a ksonas pasim, which is more or less a demonstration that he loves Yosef more than the other brothers. Yosef is the leader. He's the chosen one. And this ksonas pasim is a proclamation of leadership. And therefore the brothers, with their enmity, felt compelled to strip Yosef of his ksonas pasim, to damage it, to dip it in blood, tearing it apart, staining it. It can never be worn again. This was their way of expressing the exact antithetical statement to Yaakov. This is not our leader. We do not accept Yosef as our leader. If leadership is manifest in the choice and the preference of Yaakov for Yosef. Finally, the response of Yaakov in Pasuk Lamed Daled, Vayisabel al beno, and then in Pasuk Lamed Ches, Lamed Hey, Vayakumu kol banav, etc., lenachamo, and he refuses to be consoled. Vayomer, and he declares, Ki ered es bini avel sha'ola, I will descend on account of my son as a mourner to the grave. And on this pasuk, Rashi quotes a medrash. Imo al bini. And he says the following: Ein adam makabel tanchumin al hachai, v'savar shemeis shal hameis nigzor gzera sheish takef min alev v'lo al hachai. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Yaakov a sign. And the Medrash tells us that if none of Yaakov's children died while he was alive, he would never see Gehenna. But now that Yaakov was convinced that one of his children died, he understood that he would see Gehenna. I would like to interpret this Medrash in the light of what I've said over and over again. You may have heard it from me, that man is a shliach hakel. He is given a mission by God. He is the agent of God to fulfill God's will when God imposes upon him an assignment, a mission. And of course, Hashgacha, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, knows exactly at what time and in what context and in what community a person might find the ability to accomplish his mission. Because if God appoints an agent, a shliach, then he must endow that shliach with the ability, the capacity to fulfill that assignment. The exact time and place in which each individual will appear on the face of the earth is all designed to allow man the maximum conditions necessary to fulfill his mission is shlichus. The shlichus, the mission of Yaakov, was to raise 12 shvatim who would ultimately become Knesset Yisrael. Knesset Yisrael is an integration of different kinds of approaches, talents, thoughts, ideas, philosophies, actions, emotions. Knesset Yisrael is a unity of diverse elements and approaches, outlooks on life. Knesset Yisrael is a metaphysical entity. And Yaakov understood that even if he's left with 11 righteous sons, Knesset Yisrael would never arise, because with the death of Yosef, Yaakov would have failed to achieve his mission, his shlichus, his assignment to raise Knesset Yisrael, 12 shvatim, so divergent but integrating them into one indivisible entity. But now he realized, tragically, he would not be able to fulfill that mission because Yosef had died. And therefore, Vayemoy lisnachem vayomer ki ered es beni avel sha'ola. I end Shir with a very solemn note. This is a very serious parsha, Parshas VaYeishev. There's no let up in the solemnity of the parsha nor the haftorah. And we can only end with a prayer that we will be unified once again, and we will somehow rectify the sin of Mechiras Yosef through the Avas Chinam that will lead to the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash. Erev Yameinu Amen. Thank you all for joining me, and have a wonderful Shabbos. Parshas VaYeishev.
HaRav. Thank you.
Thank you so much.